Howdy, y'all. Today we're on with our second single case research chat, and today we're going to talk all things developing research questions. We have Scott with us. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Certainly. I'm Dr. Scott Dueker. I'm an assistant professor at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. I focus my research on early numeracy math interventions and largely only single case design.
Excellent. And you did your PhD at Ohio State University,
Uh,
right?
the Ohio State University.
I purposely did
Not,
that.
not that we're picky about that or anything, but yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
so let's start out. In what context or ways do you think, like, how can we write research questions? Well, I shouldn't say that. What types of research questions would lend themselves well to single case?
If you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention, or if you have an intervention that has multi components to it, those are really great for exploring different research questions, right? A component analysis type of research question on which part of this intervention package gives you the most bang for the buck, right?
Mhm.
And that obviously that's not a very precise question, but that's the idea, right? You're evaluating which part is important, right? Because certain, say for example, you have one that has reinforcement and um, uh, teacher feedback, right?
Mhm.
Well, one of those two might be more important than the other to the student, right? And so you're just going to kind of evaluate, and that will guide the type of research methodology that you use with that, which design that you take, right? If you're going to do alternating treatments or reversal design and pulling out certain parts and things like that. So component analysis, comparative is one package better than another package. If you've got multiple things that you can actually use as an intervention, which one
Mhm.
is better and going to produce better results and faster results for you? And those kind of ideas can go into your research question, right?
Yeah, I really love you highlighting how you can kind of do a granular analysis of your intervention. And I've seen a lot of cool proposals where people might test out an intervention through single case to kind of like dig deep, and then they might scale it up to a RCT. Or I've seen some people on the back end, they'll do an RCT and they might actually find some students who did not respond as favorably, and then they might begin to figure out how to modify that intervention
Mhm.
protocol to see effectiveness. Um,
I have seen in the past, studies start out with a small single case design and then scale up to larger and larger studies. And a small RCT and then a larger RCT. We did one of those in my doc program, but it all started with the single case design of which part of this is going to be most valuable.
Yeah, excellent. I'm going to piggyback off of that. So beyond just asking questions about functional relations being present, how can we think about writing questions that would be relevant to generalization and maintenance? And why are those two elements important to consider?
Well, generalization is key, right? Because you can implement an intervention and it be effective in that location, but if it's only if it only works for that student in that one place, have you really taught them anything, right? That's the way I should look at it. So you need to program for generalization. That's Stokes and Bear 1977. It's got to be part of your plan moving forward. And so when you write your research questions, right? Um, yes, we can look at our setting, set that up, teach it there, but we also have to do generalization probes throughout intervention and then throughout maintenance, which comes after you get a steady state in intervention. Um, so all that has to be planned, and you have to ask questions about that, right? Will this, how effective is this intervention, and will it sustain without certain prompts or however you're doing your intervention? Will it sustain long term? Will it sustain in different environments or with different materials, or across different people, right? Those questions are important to ask because it's also how you set up your study.
Yeah, I like to use the silly example of parallel parking. And it's like, man, I can get awesome at parallel parking my Camry, but you put me in like a Tacoma, I might struggle. And trying to test for generalization of that skill across different things. Um, in regards to maintenance, one of my favorite things to see is well, it's so dang hard to measure, right? And so a lot of studies you might see maintenance collected like the day after the intervention and then they walk away, or like maybe like a week later, maybe 2 weeks. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on thinking through like the pros and cons of logistics, but also what that time lag element gives you if you're able to collect maintenance data further out.
Well, that's the key, right? There is a logistical part to that because a lot of times, for example, with the studies that I do, and if I'm going into a school, I have limited amount of time, right? The semester might run out and I can't get access beyond that. I would have to come back in the fall, which is, a 3-month time lag, which could be appropriate for certain skills, right? If you're trying to study the loss of skill over the summer, for a particular math skill, that's appropriate for maintenance. Did we do the intervention all the way up to the end of the school year? If you can get access to do some probes during the summer, that's great. Probably not likely to happen. But you come back in the fall, you do some maintenance probes to see where they are, and that can be important. Maintenance is important because even if you're going to teach the skill and they learn the skill during the intervention, if you stop the intervention and they don't do that anymore and they lose the skill, then again, have you really taught them anything, right? You've
Yeah,
just
yeah.
demonstrated, yes, I can teach this, but did they really learn it? So you're kind of constrained by what availability you have with the students or your participants. Um, I personally like to go at least a month after intervention stops, and just do occasional probes to that point, right? And so do maybe 5 probes over the next month or month and a half if I've got access to that, with no intervention. That way, if they hold that steady state throughout that longer period of time, we feel more confident that they have actually learned what we taught them.
Yeah. Can we nerd out on math stuff for a second?
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things I find fascinating sometimes is the role that curriculum sequence might play into us measuring maintenance. So if you think about like you've taught a unit on, oh, I'm trying to think. Maybe I'll pick a really easy example. Two-digit addition and subtraction, let's say, without regrouping. And you
Okay.
test that, you collect maybe an initial maintenance probe like a week out, and then you wait. If that curriculum scope and sequence that's happening in Gen Ed switches to a totally different topic, that
Mhm.
student might not be ever engaging in that skill frequently, so they're getting very little practice. Versus logically, if they then shift to double digit addition and subtraction with regrouping required, they're still engaging in similar
Yes.
processes, and you're much more likely to see maintenance occur,
Yep.
which it just gets weird because it's like yeah, I think it gets weird to evaluate.
It does. Yes. No, that I totally agree with that because, you know, yes, the operations are related in some way, right? Multiplication and addition are related in some way. But if you're transitioning that quickly to something that's really different and you're not giving practice as a teacher, and maintenance practice is important, it's time filler or whatever you want to call it as a teacher, but it's important for the kids. And if your curriculum tells you to switch to something like that, you're just setting them up for failure. You're right.
Yeah, if you don't have any like retrieval practice embedded, yeah.
No.
Okay, next question, which I don't want you to steal. We will do a whole thing on this, but since we're
Okay.
talking about research questions, what are your thoughts on social validity and having research questions about social validity?
I'm all about social validity. Okay. If and I come at it from this perspective, if what we're doing is not socially or is not important to that learner and the people in their sphere, then aren't we really wasting our time? Are we doing this just for us? Right? Is it, I I like to think of my research as for everybody, for the people, for advancement of things. If it's not socially valid, if what we're doing is not socially valid for that learner, for that teacher, for that community that's around that student, then what we're doing really is just more about us and
Mhm.
and what we and us being able to do a study, right? So when we come up with ideas for research projects, right? And that's the first step. Come up with the idea, then think about the research questions. The research questions need to address whether or not the intervention that we're talking about is going to be important and valuable for that learner and what they're going to get out of it.
Yeah.
That's how I approach it.
Yeah, actually, can we segue quick? We in our class we were talking through like even how do researchers come up with research ideas number one to then come up with a research question. And so I'm wondering from some of your previous work using single case designs, how have you even came up with the research idea to then write the research question?
A lot of my stuff has come from reading literature,
Mhm.
honestly. I go out and I think about what's of interest to me for one, right? For me, it's early numeracy.
Mhm.
And so in what I see out there, what I read in the literature, and then I think about the kids that I have access to that I might be able to work with and where they, what gap can I fill in that research, right? Because there's always a gap out there. So I look for whatever gap I can find, what may or may not have been done, or if something has been done but hasn't been researched or validated um, very much, that's another potential um, study and set of research questions. So that's typically how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I love that idea because you're referencing looking at research to identify the relevance of why are you doing this while also balancing like what do you see in practice, which is the social validity angle. Like, are these outcomes important? Is this intervention going to be feasible and sustainable?
Yeah.
So I think that's excellent, excellent advice.
Mhm.
Okay, so the last big question we'll talk about are about the actual nature of your question. And so we can look at some studies that might have some purpose statements or really broad questions that will be phrased as like, what are the effects of this intervention? And then that's it.
Mhm.
And what are your thoughts on like honing your research questions to perhaps be more precise? And how does that help in the experimentation process?
Well, that's a big, broad question. So obviously your questions should be precise because the questions guide your research methodology, right? They're guiding what you're doing from there. Um, so you want to have a certain idea where you're headed, right? The precision guides where you're going. So like the question that you said, what effects does this have? That's pretty broad, right? Um, and I'm trying to step away from the hypothesis statement idea, right? Where you come up with this idea and then you test to that. Um, Here we're trying to validate a particular methodology, right? A particular intervention. That's the idea behind single case design. And so with the precision, with a question that has precision in it, I feel like we can better get to that answer.
Mhm.
Um, but you have to write the question in such a way that there is a certain amount of expectation in the outcome instead of what are the effects of um, in a component analysis research question example for say does this intervention work better with this part or without this part, right? Or does this part add more than this part does, and that's pretty specific, right? And you can adjust your experimental design that way to address that and come up with the solution when it's done.
Yeah, that's great. Because I was you were mentioning we're posing a comparative research question that's going to then perhaps dictate design choice
Yeah.
versus like component question also might inform design choice. And even if you're really wanting to think through careful generalization and maintenance data collection, that might also inform design choice as well. So all of that
Yeah.
is great.
I think that really does. I mean, design choices is important in answering your research questions.
Yeah. You mentioned hypothesis statements. So I can see you chuckling in the world of single case. Um, what do you see as some of because I've seen some of the push in research question development in single case is perhaps even specifying things as granular as like the type of data characteristic you care about. So you might say something like, is there effects of explicit timing on the increased slope of digits correct per minute for kids with math
Yeah.
difficulty? Versus perhaps leaving it open and engaging in more exploratory analysis of like, well, what does the data look like? And that your data analysis plan might be driven by the nature of the data characteristics. And so I'm wondering, clearly that much more granular focus would lend itself to perhaps a hypothesis statement. And so I don't know if you have thoughts there.
You know, I'm not a huge fan of hypothesis statements, honestly. Um, Only because I'm relatively anti-statistics overall, right? I'm more visual analysis. I get the idea of statistics. I can do that and everything. I just don't like to. That's why I like single case design, right? Visual analysis, effect sizes. Yes, that's a statistic you can choose. Um, I think that makes more sense because we're looking at such a small population. Um, to me, the null hypothesis is more broad, right? This just is not going to work, or this is going to work for everything, right? But we can't necessarily say that in a single case design. If you've got a multiple baseline design across three participants, your results are going to be different likely for all three of those, right? There's going to be a slope difference in each one. There's going to be a level effect that's different between each one probably, right? So getting into a null hypothesis type of statement with that can be too specific, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's it's definitely it's a tricky slope to begin to think about under what context you're engaging in a study. Would it make sense to perhaps uh engage in something that might fit more of the deductive approach versus something that might fit more of the inductive approach to single case?
Right.
Uh, and yeah, and that seems we could segue this into the idea of
Yeah.
like trying to
That
pre-register single case questions in the design options and like that whole area, which I'm hoping to talk about later this semester.
well, one thing I just wanted to say is that in certain aspects, we are thinking about our research questions as hypotheses, right? That's what our research questions are kind of our ideas of what we expect to happen, but we're not placing them in the same terminology, in the same vein as we would if we were doing a random control trial, a large study like that, using statistical analyses, right? That's the way I view it.
Yeah. Um, do you last question here on research questions. How do you how do you begin to shape research questions as you engage in systematic replication? So I know you're doing a lot of work in this area, early numeracy, using some tech. So if you're engaging in replication, how does that inform? Well, I guess the results of one study will then inform perhaps questions you'll ask in the next.
Yes, they will, right? So if you're going to do a replication study, you're going to look at the previous studies, research questions, and the results they got and how they, fit into the research questions of that study. And then you can piggyback off of that in certain ways, right? Um, what what were their future studies? What were the implications of that study? Um, and how can you use that information to massage the previous studies research questions to make them your own? And if you have a specific guiding idea for moving this set of research forward, that will also take precedence in some of your research questions as well, not just duplicating or trying to piggyback off those.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Scott, this has been awesome. And I really love the combo around component analysis and asking comparative research questions versus kind of just testing against this
Yeah.
business as usual baseline, and the idea of perhaps allowing for to look at like research evidence practices that we're like kind of messing with and trying to look at them more granularly.
But and you made a good point about, is it feasible for the teachers in the classroom, which is ultimately our consumer theoretically, right? Um, just from a math standpoint, right? If what we're studying and what we're trying to implement isn't feasible for them, it's not socially valid. So,
Yeah,
I mean, that's the key component for me.
yeah. And they're less likely to be taken up into practice
Yep.
outside of your little study. So,
Yep.
well, this was great. Do we have any new single case work you might be coming out with soon?
I'm writing
Or
up
any
right now
plans?
a study on a little bit of math anxiety on timed fluency versus untimed fluency, um, and comparing that with covert timing versus overt timing. So that should be finished up, writing up in the next month or so.
Wow, so you just took that head on. That's been all of the debates in the world of math intervention.
It's and it was an interesting study. We'll just say that.
Okay, excellent. I look forward to reading it. Well, thank you so much for your
You're
time today.
welcome. Anytime.